You'll take Deadwater, Vernon said, sliding the folded deed across the table with two fingers, the way a man pushes away a finished plate. $4 a back tax on it. Clear that, and it's off our books. He said it the way you name a chore you're glad to be rid of. In the fall of 1893, the sons of Alden Sill gathered in the ranch house to divide what their father had left. Vernon, the eldest, kept the home place, bottomland black as a skillet, and a spring that still ran in August. Ansel took the near pasture and the good corrals. To Elias Renn, the orphan Alden had raised from a boy, they gave the Deadwater place, a deserted quarter up under Ashfall Ridge, sagebrush to the horizon, and a caved well that had not wet a rope in years. "Does any of the spring water come with it?" Elias asked. "The spring's on the home place." Vernon's eyes found the window. "You're not blood, Elias. Nobody's turning you out cruel. You can always hire on somewhere." Elias signed his name without a word, but he had walked Deadwater once as a boy, his hand in his father's at the mouth of that dead well, and he had not forgotten what his father heard down in it. He folded the deed into his coat and stood. Cora was waiting on the porch with the wagon already loaded, because she had known before he went in what the men would decide. She did not ask how it went. She looked at the way he carried his shoulders, and she knew. "Deadwater," she said. "Deadwater." She was quiet a moment. Vernon came out onto the porch behind Elias and stood with his thumbs in his belt, a man on his own boards now, and Cora looked at him the way a woman looks at a debt she means to collect someday. Elias put his hand on her arm. "Not yet," the hand said. She let it go, but her jaw stayed set. He would not carry the anger. She would carry it for him, all the way up the ridge road, and she would still be carrying it long after he had set it down. They drove out past the home place spring, where the water ran clear over green cress even in a dry year, and Elias did not look at it. He looked at the road ahead, at the pale rise where the good ground gave out and the sage began. A man who wanted to feel robbed had only to turn his head. He kept it straight. Cora watched him not look and understood the reason he'd signed so easily, and it frightened her a little because it meant he was not resigned at all. He was betting. She'd been married to him long enough to know the difference between a man who has given up and a man who has seen something. Elias had seen something. "You're not going to fight them," she said. It was not a question. "No." "You could. Alden meant to leave you a share. Everybody in the basin knows it." "Everybody in the basin thinks Deadwater is worth $4 a back tax and a good laugh." He clicked to the mare. "Let them keep thinking it." The wagon climbed. The cedar gave out. The Deadwater quarter opened in front of them, a long dry slope tipped toward the south, choked with sage and rabbit brush, seamed with old basalt that broke through the soil like the ribs of something dead. In the middle of it, ringed by a low broken curb of stone, was the well. A rope still hung from the windlass frame, gone gray and stiff. Nothing green grew within 100 feet of it. Cora looked at all of it and kept her face still for his sake. "Well," she said, "it has a view." Elias almost smiled. He set the brake, climbed down, and walked to the well alone. He stood at the curb a long while, the way a man stands at a grave. Then he took a pebble from the ground and dropped it in. He waited. The sound came back up faint and soft, and it was not the dry click of stone on dry stone. He came back to the wagon and started unloading, and he was moving faster than he had all day. That first night they slept in the wagon bed with the dog between them. Cora woke to find Elias gone and the moon down. She found him at the well again, on his knees, with his father's old canvas roll open on the stones and a lantern turned low. The roll held a mason's hammer worn thin on one face, a plumb bob, a coil of chalked line, and a small book bound in oilcloth. The book had been rained on once and dried, and most of its pages had fused into a brick you could not open. but the last leaf had come loose from the block, and on it, in a well-digger's cramped hand, Tobias Renn had written one line his son could still read. A dry well is only a well that lost its roof. Your father, Cora said, he dug half the wells in 3 counties. Elias touched the line with one finger. People thought he found water by luck. He didn't. He found it by looking up. He tilted his head back toward the black shoulder of Ashfall Ridge above them. A well like this one isn't fed from below. It's fed from up there. Rain hits the ridge, and if the ground catches it, it walks down slow underground and finds the well. If the ground can't catch it, it runs off. It runs off and takes the topsoil with it, and the well goes dry, and everybody says the water's gone. He shook his head. The water's not gone. The roof's gone. The ground up there used to catch and hold, and something stripped it. She looked at the slope, silver under the low moon, and for the first time she saw it the way he did, not as a ruin, but as a thing waiting to be given its roof back. You knew this before you signed. I knew it when I was 9 years old, standing right here, holding his hand. Elias rolled the canvas closed. He knelt down where I'm kneeling, and he told me a man could bring this well back in a season of work if he understood what killed it. Then he died that winter, and Alden took me in, and nobody ever came up here again. He stood. I've had 20 years to think about it. He'd learned the rest of it from another man. When he was 14, Alden had hired a Cornish waller named Ferris Kell to lay the home place stock walls, and Elias had carried stone for him a whole summer for no wages and been glad of it. Kell built walls with no mortar in them at all, dry stone locked by nothing but its own weight and the sense of the man who set it, and those walls had outlasted every mortared thing on the place. Elias could still hear him. A wall must breathe, Kell would say, fitting a through stone with his eyes half shut. A wall that can't breathe fights the water. A wall that breathes lets the water pass and keeps the ground. At dawn, Elias walked the slope with the chalk line and a bundle of stakes his father had cut and never used. He was not looking for the best ground. He was looking for the old ground, for the faint stone trace he'd circled in his mind since the table, a line that ran across the hill on the level, buried under 60 years of sage. He found it by the second hour, a single course of set stones laid flat-faced by hands long dead, running true along the contour where no natural seam would run. Someone had built here once. Someone had known. He drove the first stake at the low end of that old line, and Cora wrote it in the back of the household ledger in her small, even hand. Day 1. 1 stake. The dead had already begun to build. The first wall he built was 31 feet long, and it was wrong. He knew the theory. Big stones on the bottom, flat faces turned out to the weather. The 2 skins of the wall leaned back into the hill, so the whole thing tipped toward the slope it held. Through stones every few feet, reaching clear across to lock both faces together into one body. A batter that made the wall wider at the base than the top, so it stood on its own broad feet. He knew all of it. He had carried stone for a man who did it in his sleep. But knowing a thing and doing it alone in the wind are 2 different animals, and Elias had set the wall too straight. He'd wanted it to look like Kell's walls, and Kell's walls stood plumb and proud, and so Elias built his plumb. He forgot that Kell's walls stood on flat pasture. This one stood on a slope with a hill's weight of wet ground waiting to lean on it. He capped it on a Thursday, pleased, and stood back to look at his 31 feet of new wall in the evening light. By the next Thursday, it had begun to bulge. The middle of the wall had swelled out toward the downhill side. the belly of it pushing a hand's width past the line, one capstone already tipped and threatening to walk. He stood and looked at it a long time. A weaker man would have driven a few posts behind the bulge and pretended the problem was solved. "You could brace it," Cora said, come up beside him with the ledger. She was testing him, and he knew it. "Posts would only hide the mistake until stronger water finds it." He was already pulling off his coat. "It has to come down." He took it down stone by stone, the whole 31 feet, sorting each rock into the pile it should have gone to the first time. Threw stones here, face stones there, parting rubble in its own heap. It cost him 4 days he did not have. 4 days closer to the debt, 4 days of the season burning down toward frost. He did not complain once. When Cora brought him water, he said only, "It wasn't the stone's fault," and kept working. The second time he built it leaning into the hill, top a foot narrower than the base, a through stone reaching across every 3 feet, and he let it breathe. When he capped it, it did not look proud. It looked patient. It looked like it belonged to the hill instead of standing against it. That was the wall the dog learned to sleep behind, in the strip of cool shadow it threw in the afternoon, and it was the wall the whole place would be measured against later, though nobody knew that yet. Cora wrote in the ledger, "First wall, rebuilt, 31 feet, learned the batter." Down in the basin, they had already started calling the place Renn's rockpile. The mockery came up the ridge road the way weather does, a little at a time, and then all at once. Dodge Barlow came first, a cattleman with a spread on the east side and a voice that carried. He rode up under the guise of neighborliness and sat his horse at the foot of the slope watching Elias hand-set stone in the sun. "You know there's men would pay you to build fence," Barlow said. "Good money. Instead, you're stacking rocks on a hill God gave up on." He spat. "That ground will kill your horse before it feeds your family, Renn. I've watched that hill 30 years. Nothing lives on it. Nothing ever will." "Might be," Elias said, and set another stone. Barlow waited for more and got none, which annoyed him, and he rode off telling the story of the fool on Deadwater to everyone he passed. Vernon came up the following week. He did not get off his horse either. He sat and looked at the 2 walls. His brother, the man he had been raised beside, if not his brother, had built across the barren slope, and something moved in his face that might have been unease if he'd let it. "While you're up here measuring rocks," Vernon said, "we're down there growing food. Corn's already knee-high on the bottomland." He gestured at the sage. "What is it you think you're going to grow, Elias? Basalt?" "Not this year," Elias said. "Not any year." But Vernon's eyes kept going back to the walls, to the clean, patient line of them across the hill, and he did not like that they kept doing that. He turned his horse. "Pa would have told you the same. You always did want the hard way of a thing." He rode down. He did not look back, which was its own kind of tell. Ansel came up too, the middle one, but Ansel came on foot at dusk when no one would see, and he did not sit his horse and talk down at the work. He set a sack against the well curb, cornmeal, and under it a twist of paper with squash and tepary bean seed saved from his own crop, and he said, "Lo, corn won't make it up here without water. Beans might. Squash if you shade the ground." He would not meet Elias's eye. "I told Vernon it wasn't right, the way it went. I didn't say it loud enough." "You said it," Elias said. Ansel nodded at his own boots and went back down the hill in the dark, and that was the most either of them had said about it, and it was enough. The debt came due to a man named Enoch Frame, who kept the store in Dry Cedar, and the credit for half the basin in a black book behind his counter. Elias had taken flour and nails and a keg of blasting powder on credit against the first crop that did not exist yet. Frame let him sign for it with a thin smile. "They're calling your place the rockpile," Frame said. "I hope you know that." "I've heard." $19.40 by spring. Frame closed the book. "I'm a patient man, Renn, but I'm not a foolish one. Come spring, if there's no crop, I'll be taking my 1940 out of that mare of yours, or your tools. One or the other." He looked at Elias over his spectacles. "A man ought to know the terms." "He ought," Elias agreed and shook the storekeeper's hand and walked out past the men on the porch, who went quiet, and then, when the door shut, did not. Cora ruled a new column in the ledger that night: what they owed against what they had. The what they had column was very short. She set a limit on the household: no coffee bought, no cloth, nothing that was not seed or nail or tool, and she held to it herself first, which was the only way a limit ever holds. "A wall can't carry more than it's built for," she said, quoting a man she'd never met. "Neither can a household." The crop failed before the drought ever came, and it failed because of Elias, not the sky. He'd built his first planting pockets into the slope above the second wall, hollows dug into the bank, meant to catch the fine soil in the water and give a seed something to hold in. He'd laid them out well, 14 to 18 inches deep, floored with brush to hold moisture, and topped with a mulch of flat stone to keep the sun off the ground the way Ansel had told him. He'd planted Ansel's beans and squash in them, and for 10 days they came up green, and he let himself hope. Then a hard little rain came off Ashfall Ridge, the first real water of the fall, and it drowned them. He dug the pockets too tight and floored them too flat, and the water that ran down the slope pooled in the bottoms and had nowhere to go, and the roots sat in it and rotted. He came out the morning after the rain and found the green gone slack and yellow, the stems soft at the ground line. He pulled one, and the root came up black and stinking. Nearly half of what he'd planted was gone. 43 plants of the 100 he'd counted in. Cora wrote the number in the ledger without a word, because the number was worse than anything she could have said. He knelt in the wet ruin of it for a long time. Then he did what his father's line had told him to do. He stopped looking at the plant and looked at the water. He saw where it had come in and where it had failed to leave. The pockets had caught the water, as he'd built them to. He'd only forgotten to give it a door. He rebuilt every pocket with a lip of stone at the low side, set just low enough to let the excess weep out, and run on down the slope to the next pocket instead of standing. He lined the run between them with flat rocks so the moving water would slide across stone and not cut the soil. When he was done, a pocket held water like a cupped hand that leaks a little on purpose, enough to drink, never enough to drown. He replanted with the last of Ansel's seed and some drought grass he'd gathered wild off the ridge, and this time he did not let himself hope until the second week. Cora wrote, "Pockets fixed, gave the water a door, 57 inches, 57. It was less than he'd started with. It was more than he'd had the morning after the rain. The numbers told the story more honestly than pride ever could. The third failure nearly cost him the mare, and it was the one he was most ashamed of because it came from being tired instead of being wrong. He needed big base stone, and the best of it lay in a rockfall at the top of the quarter, a long, slow haul down to the walls. The proper way was to go the long way around on the graded contour, the way that spared the animal. But the contour way took most of a day for a single load, and the debt was ticking, and the frost was coming. And one evening Elias looked at the short way straight down the fall line, steep and loose, and told himself the mare could take it. Juno was halfway down with a stone boat loaded past her weight, when the loose ground gave under her. She went down on her side, with a scream Elias felt in his own chest, the load sliding into her, one hind leg wrenched under. For one long moment he thought he had killed a good horse to save a day. He hadn't. He got the load off her and got her up, and she stood trembling with a leg that would not bear weight, and he led her down slower than he had ever led anything, talking low the whole way. Cora poulticed the leg with clay and comfrey, and they stalled her for 2 weeks, which meant 2 weeks. Elias hauled stone on his own back, a sledge and his own 2 arms, and his old shoulder, the one he'd hurt years ago carrying for Kell, flared until he could not lift his arm above his head at night. He hauled anyway, with the arm he had. "You could rest it," Cora said. "The horse is resting it for both of us." He would not put Juno back on the slope until she was sound, and he never took the short way again. He built a proper switchback into the haul road, graded on the contour, longer by half and safe. It cost him days. It always cost him days. Every honest thing did. Juno came sound. The switchback stayed. And when Elias finally let himself look at what he'd made, the 2 rebuilt walls, the leaking pockets going green, the graded road curling, down the hill on the level, he saw that every good thing on the place had started as a mistake he'd paid for and fixed. The place was not built out of his skill. It was built out of his failures, corrected one at a time, with no excuse left standing behind any of them. He did not know it yet, but that was exactly why it would hold. Emmett Dre came up the ridge in October with a transit on a tripod and a reputation for being unable to lie about a measurement even to be kind. He was the county surveyor, and he had come, he did not trouble to hide, because half the basin had bet him a supper that Renn's rockpile was the work of a crank, and he meant to collect the supper. He set his transit and shot the line of the walls and said nothing for an hour. He walked the first wall, the rebuilt one, the patient one, and put his level on the batter and the caps and the through stones. He walked the second and third. Then he came to a short stub of a wall down by the well that Elias had thrown up in the first week and never finished, the straight one, the proud one, before he had learned. Dre stood between the 2 kinds of wall for a while, looking from one to the other. Vernon had ridden up that same afternoon on the pretext of the survey, and he sat his horse at the foot of the slope in earshot, arms crossed, waiting to hear the crank called a crank. "You build both of these?" Dre asked. "I did." "When?" "That one first." Elias nodded at the straight stub. "Before I understood the ground." Dre grunted. He put his hand flat on the proud little wall and rocked it, and it moved. He put his hand on the rebuilt wall and leaned his whole weight into it, and it did not move at all. Then he turned to the men who weren't there, to the basin and its supper bet, and he said the thing plainly, the way he said everything. "The first wall was wrong." He gathered his transit. "The later ones are not. Whoever built the later ones knew what he was doing by the time he built them." Down at the foot of the slope, Vernon Sill turned his horse and rode down without a word, and he was careful, all the way down, not to look back up at the walls again. Some things a proud man cannot afford to be caught looking at. Cora wrote in the ledger that night. Surveyor came to laugh. Left measuring. Didn't stay for the supper. The rain that should have come in November did not come. Nobody worried at first. A dry fall was a dry fall. But December came dry too, and January, and the basin went into the new year with the creeks low and the stock tanks showing mud, and by the time the ground should have been greening in the spring of 1894, it had not rained a hard rain in 111 days. Down in dry Cedar Basin, the good ground began to fail. Vernon's bottomland corn, planted proud in long, straight furrows that ran up and down the slope the way his father had always run them, came up thin and then browned at the edges. The home place spring that had run in every August anyone could remember, thinned to a trickle a man could stop with his hand. Barlow's grass burned off to nothing, and his cattle started walking the fences looking for it. Up on Deadwater, the pockets held. Not lush. Nothing on that hill was ever lush. But the squash spread its broad leaves and shaded its own roots the way squash does. And the teepery beans, a bean the old desert farmers had grown for 1,000 years because it asked so little, kept their color, and the drought grass held green in the lee of the walls where the ground stayed cool. Elias walked the slope every morning and did the one test his father had taught him. He took a handful of soil from behind a wall and squeezed it in his palm, and it packed into a ball and held its shape. He walked down to the fence line where the wild ground began and squeezed a handful of that, and it ran out between his fingers like flour and blew away. He had Cora do it too, so the ledger would carry it in her hand and not just his memory. Behind the wall holds a ball, open ground, dust, day 111. The gossip changed. It changed the way gossip does, without anyone admitting it had ever run the other way. Men who'd laughed about the rockpile in the fall started saying, "in the store," with a puzzled look. "You seen Renn's ground? Why in the world is it still alive up there?" Barlow said it too, though he said it like an accusation. Adela Voss came up the ridge in the worst of it. She was a widow with a hard quarter on the north side, and no man to argue with about how to work it, and she came not to gawk, but with a question, which made her the first. "They say your ground holds water," she said, standing at the foot of the first wall. "Mine won't hold a thing. I've lost half my garden. I don't want charity, Renn. I want to know how you did it." Elias set down his hammer. "You want to know," he said. "Come up in the morning and I'll show you a pocket and a spillway, and you can build one on your own ground and see." He paused. "It's not a secret. Nobody would believe it if I gave it away anyhow." She came in the morning. She stayed till noon. She left with dirt under her nails and a diagram on the back of a seed envelope. And she was the second person, after a dead man, to look at dead water and see what it was instead of what it wasn't. The one who broke came last, and he came in the dark. Vernon rode up on a moonless night, in the worst week of the drought, and stopped his horse at the foot of the slope, out past the reach of the lamplight, where a man could watch and not be seen. He sat there a long time. Elias knew he was there. The dog had told him. One low rumble and then quiet, the way the dog only went quiet for family. Elias did not go down. He let his brother sit in the dark and look at the green strip on the dead hill and the brown ruin of the bottomland he could not see behind him but knew was there. After a while, Elias heard the horse turn and go back down. In the morning, on the well curb, there was a single fist-sized stone that had not been there the night before, set square on the flat, the way a man sets a stone when he's thinking about how they go together. Elias looked at it for a long moment. He did not ask who had carried it up. He already knew. He carried a bucket to the well then, the way he did every morning, and lowered it and drew it up. 3 months of walls and pockets and graded ground catching what little the ridge gave and walking it down slow into the dark under the hill. The bucket came up with 2 inches of water standing in the bottom of it, muddy and cold and real. A dry well is only a well that lost its roof. He stood in the gray light with the wet bucket in his hand and did not smile, because down in the basin men he'd been raised beside were watching their good ground die of thirst, and there was no gladness to be had in that. None he'd allow himself. He set the bucket down. He looked up at the black shoulder of Ashfall Ridge, where all the water came from, and where, when it finally came, it would come too hard and too late. Emmett Dre had said it to him once, standing between the 2 walls. "You've got the ground drinking now. Good. But mind, a storm after a drought is the dangerous one. Hard, dry ground doesn't drink water. It sheds it. He'd looked up at the ridge the way Elias was looking at it now. No wall gets to be certain before the storm. The drought had not delivered its verdict. It had only begun collecting evidence. By the second week of June, the basin had gone past dry into something the old men had no word for. 140 days without a hard rain. The home place spring quit altogether. One morning, just stopped, a wet stain on the rock where 40 years of water had run. Vernon hauled from the river 4 miles off now, 2 barrels a trip, and the river was low enough to walk across without wetting a knee. Up on Deadwater, the well held its 2 inches, and then 3. Not because there was more water in the country, there was less. The well held because everything above it had been built to give the little that fell a place to go, and a slow road to travel. The valley was rich and dying. The hill was poor and alive. It was the whole argument, laid out in the ground for anyone with eyes. The hard choice came in the driest week, and Cora watched Elias make it, and knew it was the truest thing he'd built. He could have doubled his planting. The pockets were working. A bolder man would have dug 40 more and put in every seed he had, betting the drought would break and the rain would reward the man who'd planted widest. Elias dug nothing new. He walked the slope and thinned instead, pulled healthy plants and fed them to the mare, until each pocket held only what the ground beneath it could keep alive. "You're pulling good beans," Cora said. "Every extra plant is another mouth asking the ground for water it doesn't have." He wiped his hands. "Strengthen what's living. Don't spread it thinner. A wall doesn't get stronger by getting longer." She wrote it in the ledger because it was the kind of thing worth having in a dead man's hand someday. Thinned to what the ground can carry, did not expand. The mercy came a week after that, and it cost them. Ansel rode up gaunt one evening. He would not ask, so he talked around it. The stock down in the near pasture, the water hauled and never enough, a heifer he'd lost that morning. Vernon's cattle were worse, he said, and Vernon would not say so to a living soul. Vernon would sooner watch them die than come up this hill and ask. Elias listened. Then he looked at the well, and at the mare, and at Cora. "We've got water, they don't," he said. "Some of it, not much." Cora did him the kindness of not making him say the rest. She went to the ledger and drew a line through the one thing they had allowed themselves that spring, a little money set by for glass to close in the wagon into a real house before winter. She crossed it out clean. "Then we can spare a barrel a week," she said. "2, if we go without the glass." She looked at her husband. "It's your call. He's the one that signed you onto this hill." "That's why it's got to be the well that answers him," Elias said. "Not me." They filled a barrel, and Ansel hauled it down, and the next week another, and Elias never once rode down to see it drunk or to be thanked for it. He gave the water and kept the distance, which was the only way the water stayed a mercy and did not become a lesson. Vernon knew where it came from. A man knows the taste of the water he denied another man. He drank it, and he said nothing to anyone, and something in him that had been standing very straight for a long time began, quietly, to lean. The well never ran dry. But it dropped. Sharing it cost inches Elias could not spare, and every inch it dropped was a bet against a sky that would not rain. He watched the water fall in the well and did not take the barrels back. Some things you don't measure in the ledger. Emmett Dray came up in July with his coat over his arm and the look of a man who has read the sky and not liked it. "You feel that?" he said. The air had gone heavy and wrong, a wet weight on a country that had forgotten what wet felt like. "That's not relief coming, Renn. Whatever you're praying for, don't. A slow rain on this ground would soak in. What's stacking up over the ridge won't be slow." He nodded west, where a line of thunderheads was building over ashfall, black-bottomed and shot with light. A storm after a drought is the worst thing this basin can get. The ground's baked to a brick. It won't drink. It'll shed every drop straight downhill, all at once, and take the country with it. How long? Elias said. Day. Maybe 2. Dre put his coat on. Everything you built to hold water gentle is about to get asked to pass water hard. Those spillways of yours, the ones that send the flood onto bare rock instead of into the next wall, you'd best know which one is your weakest, because that's the one that'll answer for all of them. He got on his horse. And you'd best warn the valley, though I don't guess they'll hear it from you. They wouldn't. Elias sent Ansel down with the word, a storm coming hard, get the stock to high ground, and for God's sake don't let water run straight down a slope. Ansel carried it to Vernon. Vernon was already at work when the word came. He'd looked at the same sky and drawn the opposite lesson. If the rain came hard, he reasoned, a man wanted it off his fields fast, so he dug a trench, a straight, deep, proud trench running down the fall line of the bottomland to carry the flood away quick to the river. It was the sensible thing, by the logic of a man who'd never once let water teach him. Get the water gone, get it downhill and out. Tell Vernon not to, Elias said when he saw what his brother was digging. Tell him a straight ditch down a slope isn't a drain. In a storm, it's a knife. It'll gut his own field before it ever reaches the river. Ansel told him. Vernon did not stop digging. He said, Ansel reported back, not able to look at Elias. He said he's not taking farming advice from a man who grows rocks. Elias nodded slowly. There was nothing in it to answer. He turned back to his own hill and did the only thing left to do, which was to find his weakest spillway before the storm did. He found it below the third wall, a rock-lined channel he'd built early, before his hands were sure, meant to catch the overflow from 2 pockets and shed it sideways onto a shelf of bare basalt where hard water could do no harm. But he'd lined it too shallow and set the throat too narrow, and he knew, looking at it now with a storm 2 hours out, that if the flood came the way Dre promised, that narrow throat would choke and the water would jump the lip and pour into the wall below it instead of onto the rock. He had 2 hours. He tore the throat open wider, doubled the lining, and set a row of big flat stones to fling the overflow clear onto the basalt shelf. He was still setting the last of them when the first wind came down off the ridge, cold and full of the smell of rain, and the light went the color of a bruise. Which face turns uphill? He said to himself, fitting the last stone, the old question Kell used to make him answer for every rock. The flat one, always the flat face against the weight. He set it flat face up and stepped back, and there was no more time. Cora, he called, get Juno in the lee of the first wall and stay there. Then the sky came down. It did not rain the way rain falls. It fell the way a lake falls when its bottom drops out. The first wave came off Ashfall Ridge in the dark, a wall of water down a slope that had forgotten how to drink. Elias saw it hit the top of his quarter and fan out, and then he saw his walls take it. The uppermost terrace caught the first surge and slowed it, and where the water topped the wall, it did not pour over in a sheet, but found the pockets, and the pockets filled and passed their overflow to the spillways, and the spillways flung it sideways onto the bare rock and let it hammer stone that could not be hurt. The whole hill did in an instant what it had been built over a year to do. It broke one great killing flood into 100 small survivable ones. Each wall accepted what it could hold. Each spillway released what it could not. Down in the basin, there were no walls to break the water into pieces. Elias could see it between the sheets of rain lit up in the lightning, the bottomland going under. Vernon's straight corn furrows run up and down the slope the way his father had always run them, filled and joined and became a single racing sheet, and the sheet found the deepest cut and poured into it. And the deepest cut was the trench Vernon had dug to save himself. It did exactly what Elias had said it would. It became a knife. The flood tore into that straight, proud trench and widened it in seconds, ripping the black loam out by the yard, gutting the best field in dry cedar basin down to the pale clay beneath, while its owner stood in the rain and watched a lifetime wash toward the river. Elias did not watch long. He had his own storm. The narrow spillway, the one he'd torn open with 2 hours to spare, held. The water he'd feared came down the third wall in a brown rope, hit the widened throat, and shot clean out onto the basalt shelf and away, and the wall below it never felt more than a wet finger. He had time to feel the relief of it before the lightning showed him the real trouble. The second wall was going, not from water topping it, from below. The saturated ground behind it had turned to a heavy wet weight the wall had never been asked to hold all at once, and a section in the middle, near where the old buried stone line ran, a weak seam he'd built across without knowing, had begun to bow, then to belly, the way his very first wall had bellied a year ago, except this time with a hill of moving water behind it. If it went, it would take the pockets above it and send the whole upper flood down onto the walls below in one unbroken load, and then they would all go, one into the next, and the hill would be a mudslide, and the well beneath it would be buried for good. He went for it. He knew going, that it was the wrong arithmetic, one man against a wall that 100 tons of water wanted down. But a man doesn't do that arithmetic in a storm. He gets his shoulder to the stone that's moving, and he tries to buy the ground one more minute. Elias got to the bowing section and jammed the biggest through stone he could lift into the widening gap, low, where it might key the two faces together long enough for the surge to pass. He got it half set. Then the ground let go under his own feet, the same loose fall-line ground that had put the mayor down a year before, and it put him down now, and the sliding stone came with it, and his bad shoulder went under a rock the size of a stove with the water rising around his face. He could not move it. He could not move himself. The water came up cold and fast and found his mouth. It was Ansel who came. Ansel had not gone home. Ansel had ridden up the ridge in the first of the storm. Nobody ever learned exactly why, whether he'd come to help or only because he could not bear to sit in his brother's house and watch the valley drown, and he was there in the lightning when Elias went down. He got both hands under the stove-sized rock, and he did the thing a man can only do when it's someone's life, and he lifted what could not be lifted, just far enough, just long enough, and dragged Elias out from under it by the collar into shallower water. The two of them lay in the flood at the foot of the bowing wall, and Ansel got his shoulder against the stone Elias had been trying to set, and Elias got his good arm to it, and between them, half drowned, they seated the through stone in the gap. It keyed. The wall stopped bowing. The surge came, and the wall held it, and passed it down through the spillways the way all the others were passing it, and the flood spent itself down the hill in 100 small pieces, and ran off harmless onto the bare rock and away. The two of them stayed down in the mud a long time after, in the rain, not talking, because there was nothing that needed saying that the last hour hadn't already said. The dog rode it out in the lee of the first wall, dry, curled in the cool soil behind the patient stone, the way it slept every afternoon. Juno stood beside it, unhurt. The oldest wall on the place, the one Elias had built wrong and taken down stone by stone and built again humble. That wall didn't so much as shed a cap. Morning came clean and terrible, the way it does after a storm, the sky washed and innocent over a country that had been broken in the night. Elias walked his hill with his arm in a sling Cora had made him, and could not quite believe what he was seeing. The place had not just survived, it had gained. The flood that stripped the valley had carried its stolen soil downhill and slammed it into his walls, and his walls had caught it, and behind every terrace lay a fresh bank of silt, fine and dark and rich. 5 to 8 inches of the valley's own lost topsoil now settled onto the poor hill and waiting to be planted. The well stood higher than it had all summer. The pockets were full. Deadwater had drunk the whole storm and kept it. Down in the basin it was the reverse of a harvest. Vernon's bottomland, the black loam, the pride of the estate, the good half of what a dead man had left his sons, lay gutted. The straight trench had become a canyon down the middle of it. The straight furrows had become a fan of erosion knives. Where there had been a foot of topsoil, there was pale clay and cobble, the soil gone downstream in a night. Some of it Elias suspected and did not say, sitting now behind his own walls. Barlow's grass flats were scoured to bedrock. The home place spring that had run for 40 years and quit in the drought would never run the same again, its whole gathering ground torn open above it. Emmett Dray came up mid-morning with a rod and a tape and measured, because measuring was the only honest thing left to do, and he was the only man in the basin trusted to do it. He measured the silt behind Elias's walls, 6 inches in the upper terraces, near 8 in the lowest. He rode down and measured the valley. Soil loss he wrote down, and then read twice because he did not like the number. He came back up. "You gained 6 to 8 inches of soil," he told Elias. He said it flat, the way he said everything. "The valley lost more than that, in one night." He rolled his tape. "I've measured this basin 20 years. I never expected to write down that the Deadwater place had the best ground in it." He wrote it down anyway, and no one argued with the measurements. Nature already had. Vernon came last. He came up the ridge road on foot in the afternoon because his horse was needed below and because, Elias thought, a man who has been that wrong wants to feel the whole climb in his legs. He came with his hat in his hands, and the mud of his ruined field dried to his knees, and he stopped at the foot of the first wall, the patient one, and he looked up the hill at the terraces holding their new dark soil, and at the full well, and at his younger, not brother, the man he'd been raised beside and had handed a rockpile and $4 of tax and a bit of contempt. He did not apologize. Elias would not have known what to do with an apology, and Vernon was not built to give one, and the moment was too large for words that small. What Vernon said, turning his hat in his hands, looking not at Elias but at the walls, was, "Which spillway failed?" It was the only question worth asking. It was a builder's question. It meant, "Teach me." It meant, "I was wrong in a way I can't take back, and the only thing left is to learn what you know." It meant everything an apology would have meant and more. Because a man can say sorry and change nothing, and no man asks which spillway failed unless he means to build one himself. "None of them failed," Elias said. He did not say it with any triumph in it. There was no triumph to be had, standing over the grave of his brother's field. "The narrow one nearly did. I widened it 2 hours before the storm." He paused. "The second wall nearly went. Ansel and I set a stone in it in the dark. It held." Vernon looked at his brother Ansel, standing off to the side, and understood a great many things at once about where his brother had been in the storm and whose life he'd pulled out of the mud. And Vernon's jaw worked, and he said nothing, and that was right. "Show me," Vernon said, "how you turn a stone." They built together after that, and it was not a thing of one grand afternoon, but of a whole season of ordinary ones. Vernon came up first with a wagon of stone, good squared stone hauled off the wreck of his own foundations, because there was nothing to build down in the basin now but grief, and a man has to put his hands to something. He unloaded it at the foot of the hill without a word about what it was for, and then he climbed up and stood next to Elias at a half-built terrace and waited to be told what to do, which for Vernon Sill was its own kind of miracle. "Which face turns uphill?" Elias asked him, handing him a stone. Vernon turned it over in his big hands, the field hands that had never set a dry stone in his life, and studied it and got it wrong, and turned it again and got it right. "The flat," he said. "Flat against the weight." "Flat against the weight," Elias agreed. Ansel learned faster, because Ansel had been paying attention from the sack of cornmeal onward. He learned to feel a through stone by its heft, and to hate a wall that stood too proud. Adelavos came and learned, and went home, and built terraces on her north quarter that held the next rain. Others came, men who had laughed about the rockpile in a dry fall, and had nothing left to laugh with after the flood, and Elias taught every one of them the same way, by handing them a stone, and asking which face turned uphill, and never once by reminding them what they'd said. The nearest thing to an accounting between Elias and Vernon came one evening over coffee. Cora had bought coffee again. The ledger could bear it now, and she brought 2 tin cups up to where the men sat against the rebuilt first wall in the cool of it, the dog asleep in the shadow at their feet. They drank without talking for a while. "Next season," Vernon said at last, looking out over the basin, "I'm not running my furrows downhill. I'll run them on the level, the way you set your walls." He turned his cup in his hands. "I should have asked how you did it a year ago. I told myself there was nothing up here worth asking about." "There wasn't," Elias said. "A year ago it was a rockpile." He drank. "It got to be something because it got a season of being wrong and fixed. Same as anything." Vernon almost smiled, which for him was a great deal. "Pa always said you wanted the hard way of a thing." Pa was right. Down in Dry Cedar, Enoch Frame opened his black book one morning that fall and found Elias Renn standing at the counter with a sack of tepary beans and squash, the first crop off the rebuilt hill, harvested from the valley's own soil the flood had delivered to him. Frame weighed it. It more than covered $19.40. He took his payment, and then, because he was not a foolish man and had learned which way the basin was going to build from now on, he took up his pen and drew a single line through the rest of the debt. "They stopped calling it the rockpile," Frame said, not looking up. "Down at the store. Thought you'd want to know." "What do they call it now?" "The Deadwater place." Frame closed the book. "Only they don't say it like it used to mean nothing." Adelavos asked him the question once, near the end of that fall, standing at the well watching him draw up a bucket that came full to the rope. "Did you ever think about giving up? Out here that first year with the whole basin laughing?" Elias set the bucket on the curb. He looked up at Ashfall Ridge, gone gold in the low light, where all the water came from and always had. "Most mornings," he said. He drew another bucket and did not explain, and she understood that the answer was not the point. The buckets were the point. He'd gotten up most mornings that had wanted to be his last, and set one more stone, and turned one more face uphill, and that was the whole of it. Deadwater never became richer than the valley below. It never made a drop of water of its own. It only caught what the ridge gave and slowed it, and gave it a slow road down through the ground to the well, and held the soil in place long enough for something to grow in it. That was all it ever did. That was everything. The drought had proved that rich soil can die of thirst. The flood proved that deep soil can vanish in a single night. Deadwater endured for a different reason. Every stone in it had been set wrong once, or set right by a man who'd learned from setting it wrong. Every wall, every pocket, every spillway given a purpose it could carry, and no more. And when the sky finally came down off Ashfall Ridge to judge the whole basin at once, it did not judge the ground by how black it was, or the men by how loud they'd laughed. It judged the work. Elias turned a last stone in his hands, the way Kell had taught him 20 years gone, the way he'd taught his brother that fall. He found the flat face. He set it against the weight, into the wall the dog slept behind, the first wall, the one he'd built wrong and torn down stone by stone and built again humble. It sat true. He did not stand back to admire it. There was another one to set. Purpose proved stronger than pride,